So yes, my title for the talk that Shantikara suggested is Participating in the Flow of Kalyana Mitrata. Participating in the Flow of Kalyana Mitrata. So I like that title, actually. Well done. It's a good title. And really, it's the foundation of all of the work that we're doing with young people or groups or in all the spheres that we're united here because we want to spread the Dharma. And of course, the principle is that we spread the Dharma through friendship. This is one of the things that Sangharakshita has really tried to explore in his teachings about how important it is that really in spreading the Dharma and being a kind of bodhisattva in the world, spreading the Dharma collectively is actually about a network of friendship and a flow of friendship. In a way, you could say the bodhisattva is a friend in the world. In fact, that's how they do talk about the bodhisattva in some of the Mahayana sutras, a friend in the world. And that's what we're, in our collective context, trying to become, is a friend to the world. So we've got, I'm sure you all know this, it's one of the main emphases of the Triratna Buddhist community is Kalyana Mitrata, or spiritual friendship. But it can be quite confusing, I think, at times as well, because we talk about friendship and the word friendship can mean quite a large range of relationships. And we get a sense when we first get involved with the movement that we're talking about friendship, but it's not quite the same as the friendships that we're used to. So it's not friendship because we all go out clubbing together or go down to the pub together, or you might go clubbing and go to the pub together, but that's not really the basis of the friendship. And, you're sort of a bit uncertain about, you sort of see people going off in their twos down the lane at Adhisthana and the Buddhist centre around the local park or whatever. And you think, what is that? Am I meant to be doing that? Am I meant to be having coffees with people? And I feel terribly awkward about that. And how on earth do I ask someone to go out for a coffee with me without sounding like I'm asking them out on a date? So I think there's a lot of confusion, and sometimes we're not sure what this model of Kalyana Mitrata actually means. So to go back to the Pali itself, it's from the root kal, which means to impel or incite or urge on. So in a way that gives us a deeper flavour of what Kalyana means. It means to really bring people on to a higher level. There's a sort of three meanings of the word Kalyana, which is it's kind of complex term that has within it the ideals of truth and goodness and beauty. So it can mean all those things, and it's often translated in various ways that give emphasis to either the truth aspect, that which kind of brings us on to the goal, the goodness aspect, so the sort of ethical aspect, what's Kalyana is good. For example, in the Dhammapada, it says, be quick to do what is morally beautiful, Kalyana. So be quick to do what is Kalyana. And in that sense, they mean a kind of ethically skillful action. But it can also mean beautiful. It also has a kind of aesthetic tone to it as well. So it's got all these meanings. It's a very, very rich word. It's got it's mainly a friendship. Kalyana Mitrata, Mitrata means friend, friendship, is friendship based on love of truth, love of goodness, of ethical practice, and love of beauty. It's a bit like Aristotle talked about friendship based on the love of the good. He says there's three types of friendship. There's friendship based on pleasure, so enjoying each other's company. There's friendship based on utility, so working together, doing some projects together. And there's friendship based in the love of the good. And he said, well, friendships based in pleasure and utility last while the pleasure and utility last. But friendship based in the love of the good is far more enduring. And I think it comes to a very, very important principle that's very profound and deep. Far deeper than I've really understood over the years, which is this truth that the Dharma life has to be shared. Sometimes we can think we can get away with a kind of private Dharma life, that if we could just go away into a little hut somewhere and just meditate, that will be enough for us. But it really, really wouldn't be enough for us. And there's very important reasons why it wouldn't be enough. And you can really see this in the life of the Buddha. One thing that fascinates me about the life of the Buddha, and I think says so much about awakening to reality, to a deeper understanding of reality, is that in the life of the Buddha, even the Buddha himself just had to share his Dharma life. And sometimes it hasn't really got a purpose to it. And these are the stories that I'm really interested in. Sometimes he just calls his friends out just to share things, share little inspirations or reflections. In fact, there's a whole book of these reflections that he's had called the Udana, which literally means exhalation, but it means inspiration. It's when he was just inspired to speak. He was reflecting on something and he just wanted to say it out loud. There's other stories. There's a whole chapter of a particular book in the Pali literature which is about the songs of Vangisa. I really like this. I've got into this recently of this character Vangisa, who's he's a poet, but obviously his music was sung. And the Buddha there would be something going on in the with the monks or the community, as whoever they were. Sometimes it was more than the monks. Sometimes there were lay people as well, nuns, all sorts of people, and they'd be having sort of Dharma discussion, or they'd be talking about something really important. And Vangisa, I think I feel a sympathy for Vangisa because I think he was an extrovert, and he got very, very inspired and delighted. And I just always feel a bit like him. It's almost like he couldn't contain himself, and he sort of stands up and he puts his robe over his shoulder, which it probably was a bit more sensible than this, but I kind of imagine him sort of arranging himself and saying, please, Buddha, I want to say something. I'm really inspired to speak. And I don't know if I read too much in these things. I suspect I probably do. But I imagine that you get this sense that the Buddha just is delighted by Vangisa. He's just really happy that Vangisa is so delighted and wants to say something. And and the Buddha says, "Oh yes, you must just go ahead, Vangisa. Say what you want to say." And Vangisa sings this beautiful song about the merits of Sariputta and the merits of Moggallana and the merits of the Buddha and how beautiful they are. And sometimes he talks about his own spiritual journey, and he's obviously a great romantic, and how he fell in love and didn't go quite so well, and fell in love with the Buddha, and it's just, you can see that they're all just enjoying this. You can imagine him sort of singing these beautiful songs, so rich, so delightful, so full of pleasure and joy. And sometimes the Buddha just says, "Oh, have you got any other inspiration you'd like to share with us, Vangisa?" So sometimes he's asked twice, and I feel like that there's it's almost like the delight of the Dharma life can't be contained in one body. It can't be contained within us. There's something about human nature that has to share. There's also my great favourite story about Yeshe Sogyal, who was disciple of Padmasambhava. And her biography is full of these examples where she seeks out other practitioners, other disciples of Padmasambhava, just to share practice together. And it's sometimes they arrive in quite unusual ways to meet each other. It being a tantric biography, sometimes they fly through the air. But whatever their means of transportation, they come together, and Yeshe Sogyal starts talking about, the deepest longings of her human heart, just to be free from samsara, and how all beings are caught up on this wheel of birth and death, and how she longs for freedom, not just for herself and for others. And, and another practitioner will respond in kind, talking about the real depths of their practice. And then they'll share teachings together that they've learned, and they'll share the experiences that they've had in meditation and in putting the teachings into practice. And I feel like that's such a kind of a story of the heart of the Sangha, of practitioners coming together and in their own ways, sharing their spiritual lives, their Dharma lives with each other. Sangharakshita said in his talk, it's not got a great title, but it is a good talk. Anyway, his talk is called The Case of Dysentery. Anyway, if you haven't heard it, you'll have to listen to it to understand what that's all about. But actually, a lot of it is about spiritual friendship. And he says, he's got this very mysterious paragraph in there, which I reflect on again and again. Don't worry, it's not about dysentery. It's too close to supper to talk about dysentery. He says, there exists within the enlightenment experience, within the heart of reality, an element of communication, an element of spiritual friendship, something that found expression in the later history of Buddhist thought as that rather mysterious concept of Sambhogakaya. So there exists within the enlightenment experience, within the heart of reality, an element of spiritual friendship. So what he's saying is not just that spiritual friendship is a means to an end. It's not a means to the goal of liberation. It's actually liberation itself. It's actually understanding itself. It's not that you get enlightened just through your friends and then, thanks for that. That was great. It's almost like only in enlightenment itself are you the true friend. And I keep coming back to this sentence because what it's saying to me is that friendship has a limitless potential. There's no end to friendship. It's not a utilitarian kind of goal. And of course, friendship has a limitless potential, because what we're doing in our Dharma lives is we're going beyond an identity that excludes others. We're going beyond this dichotomy of a fixed self and a fixed other. We're going beyond that separation and that polarization into me, mine, grasper and grasped, self and other. And what that means beyond that, all that language, is that we are profoundly and deeply not alone. That's what that actually means. I find that quite difficult to take on. But I know that if I could really take on that principle at ever deeper levels, that I am profoundly and deeply not alone, I would be a better friend. So friendship is the goal. It's not just a means to a goal, it is the goal. Because when you really, really realize that we're not fixed and separate, then we can truly be a friend to others. And this is, in a way, the kind of genius of Bhante Sangharakshita, because he really saw the importance of friendship, and that's the emphasis that he brought out in Triratna. I was rereading the other day Moving Against the Stream, which is his autobiography about setting up the order and movement. And he had two choices when he came to the UK. He had two choices. He was either involved with the Buddhist Society, which was people who were interested in Buddhism and practiced it to some extent. And in a way, they were all, the Buddhist Society the emphasis wasn't on lifestyle, the emphasis was an interest in Buddhism. But you got the impression that there weren't very developed friendships within that. People would engage and then they'd take an interest and then they'd go home. It wasn't really building anything. It wasn't really building a community. That wasn't its purpose. And the other thing he had the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, which was the monastic model. And I think reading about that, you realise, even though you've got a community of monks there with Sangharakshita, just how lonely that life was. And I think it was lonely because it was focused on lifestyle and not connection. So the whole point of it was this reverence to the monks, who were the true Buddhists because they were living a monastic lifestyle. And there was a great split between the monk and the lay. But it seemed to me like the monks didn't have very deep communication with each other either. They didn't necessarily build a community from their own side because the emphasis is on lifestyle and not their connections with each other. And the way Sangharakshita talks about it is he talks about how it was his friendship with Dado Rinpoche, one of his teachers, and Terry Delamere that really made him understand friendship. And I feel a lot of gratitude to both those people in his life. He said that, somehow his relationship with Dado Rinpoche managed to kind of get through his sort of English reserve and Dado Rinpoche's Tibetan politeness and formality, and they sort of communicating in slightly broken Hindi. And because they got to know each other in Kalimpong, in the foothills of the Himalayas, where they both lived. But they managed to get through this kind of formality and get into a real shared understanding and communication of the Dharma, become true friends. And I think Sangharakshita said, well, that was it was his only true friend at that time. And when he came over to the UK, he became friends with Terry Delamere. And I think he was able to just drop the monastic conventions, because at that time he was the most senior monk in the UK. He was able to drop those monastic conventions and just have a friend. There's a whole description of them touring around Europe in the little bus. And I think that Sangharakshita must be a very intense person to travel with. He gives a list. Oh my goodness. He gives a list of all the books that he's read. And I was thinking, how on earth did you manage to kind of look round the whole of, places in Tuscany and Siena and all these places and read that incredible book list? So, I do really, really have a lot of gratitude for Terry for being able to just sort of move through that kind of book list, and someone who's so highly intelligent and, had such a kind of depth of vision, and just be a friend, just a simple friend. Sometimes Sangharakshita would go back to his flat, Terry's flat in London, and they just listen to records together. And if you know the kind of monastic conventions in Asia, you can see how significant that is, to just be able to drop everything, to just listen to records, just to talk and paint and travel together. So through those friendships with Dado Rinpoche and Terry Delamere, he really saw the beauty and the potential of sharing the Dharma life in friendship, and how that enriched the Dharma life and deepened the Dharma life. But it is a high ideal. And sometimes I think there's a tendency to feel the lack. Sometimes we're presented with these high ideals of spiritual friendship, and we sometimes think, well, have I got deep enough friendships? Do I have that kind of friendship in my life? So I wanted to say something a little bit about my reflections about friendship within the Sangha over the years in the work that I've done. So I'll say something about, well, first of all, participating in the flow. That's why I like this title of this talk, because it is a flow of Kalyana Mitrata. It's not a static thing. It's not a static state. So when we hear about spiritual friendship, we can really fix ourselves on who is my spiritual friend? And we can categorize, this is my spiritual friend and this is my worldly friend. I'm going to go to the pub with my worldly friend and hope that my spiritual friend doesn't see what I'm doing. That's the most polarized it's going to be. Hopefully it's not as polarized as that. But actually that's not necessarily in line with our experience, because it might not always be that clear. Often we have what we might class. If there's going to be a spiritual friend, there's going to be a worldly friend. So we might class someone as a kind of worldly friend, who we haven't met through the Sangha, who is also, funnily enough, a spiritual being with high aspirations and spiritual longings, and who sometimes shows a glimmering of something secret and pure and a glimpse of the transcendent. One can have that experience with family and friends. So it's not to rule it out that happens. That little quality of Kalyana, truth and goodness and beauty, a little spark of inciting and urging on, a spark of the transcendental, can be found within people who we might not regard necessarily as officially spiritual friends. And on the other hand, spiritual friendship itself can also include pleasure and utility. And sometimes it's quite, it's quite dependent on those things. You can find that you've got some friends in the Sangha who you really enjoy being with, but that's very conditioned on you enjoying being with them. It might be that you work together and the spiritual friendship doesn't quite continue after you stop working together. So yes, there's a seed of spiritual friendship based in love of the good, but then there's also pleasure and utility. And sometimes at different stages in our friendship, it might be pleasure and utility that's higher. Sometimes it might be that love of the good is higher. So what can happen is, instead of you having these sort of static friends in different compartments, there's an experience of a kind of flow or a dance, a flow of Kalyana Mitrata, where friendship ebbs and flows depending on conditions. Because like anything else, friendship is dependent upon conditions, and arises in when those conditions are ripe, when the conditions are ready. For spiritual friendship arises, and when those conditions cease, spiritual friendship also has maybe a quieter phase or disappears altogether. So I tend to think less on like who's my spiritual friend, and more on allowing the conditions of spiritual friendship to come into being, and spiritual friendship arising on conditions like a kind of beautiful iridescent ball. Sangharakshita says this at one time. He said sometimes between the friends there's this kind of beautiful iridescent ball that hovers amongst them. And I think about that image more, that sometimes friendship isn't just one thing. It's under certain conditions, it arises like a little kind of magical force. They talk about that in the life of the Buddha. There's a story, I won't go into it at length because I often talk about it, but there's one very mysterious sutta where the Buddha calls out Ananda in what one assumes is in the night, or at least early in the evening. And he says to Ananda, "Do you approve of Sariputta?" And Ananda, there's no way he's going to say no. Actually, I've been meaning to say something about that for a while. He's not going to say no. It's a leading question. So Ananda says, I really approve of Sariputta. You'd be mad not to approve of Sariputta. He's bright wisdom, sharp wisdom, quick wisdom. He's easy to talk to. He's even easy to talk to about difficult things. And the Buddha just nods, and then he agrees. And you can get the impression that they start just rejoicing in Sariputta's merits. And as they do so, this is the really weird bit, all the devas start arriving, shining in different resplendent lights, like the sun on an autumn day, or the moon, or like a sapphire on a brocade cloth, or like gold, shining gold. So you get the impression there's all these devas sort of manifesting all these colours around. And they start rejoicing in the merits of Sariputta. The Buddha's just sitting there amongst this cosmic light show, and Ananda, and they're all rejoicing in Sariputta. And then the devas say, and Sariputta is adorned by the teacher's praise, and the Buddha replies, he awaits the time, which I always find wonderfully mysterious. But that's what spiritual friendship is like. Sometimes we come together on the basis of positive communication, and something is brought into being that's mysterious and beautiful and greater than the sum of its parts. And I also think, I'm not going to labour the point, but I also think that what is brought into being lasts lifetimes. I think there's a timeless quality to it. It's not confined to one lifetime. But of course, the retreat ends, and Ananda and the Buddha go to bed and finish their talk, and things change again. So one mustn't fix on to spiritual friendship at one time. It's something that emerges on dependence upon conditions. And within that, you've got horizontal and vertical friendship. So this is part of the flow as well. There's a flow over time, but there's also a flow in direction. So horizontal friendship, well, I hope that you are all experiencing horizontal friendship right now, actually, in this on this retreat, on the Changemakers and the Groups and Pioneers event, that you're in this together. You've got a feeling that you're in this together, that you've got the same ideals, the same commitment to working grounds, what Sangharakshita calls the vital mutual responsiveness on the basis of common ideals and principles. So there's a sense that we're doing the similar project for similar reasons together. We're growing together. We're responding to each other. I really do love this phrase, vital mutual responsiveness. So one person's enthusiasm ignites another person's enthusiasm, who then ignites their enthusiasm. And we share ideas. I've been so impressed by just the sincerity and depth to which people are bringing to their groups and the young people's groups back in your centres. Like, there's such a level of care and there's such a level of intelligence about what we're doing that's really quite heartening, actually. I wish I could report back to Sangharakshita. I used to sometimes do that. I think he'd be really, really delighted. And it's such a rich way to live a life. It's such a rich way to live a life. In fact, it's the most pleasurable times in my life are when I feel like I can share the Dharma with someone, where we're in a project together and on the basis of something that I care so deeply about. I remember really wonderful days when we worked at the evolution shop. So we used to have these shops that some of you know that made money for a lot of the Buddhist centres, which you wouldn't have Buddhist centres without these evolution shops. And I had a great friend called Sarah Oldfield. And I remember this one Christmas, and it was really hard work at Christmas, but that's where we made all our money. And I really like money. And I particularly like making it and giving it away. And I remember the immense satisfaction of having like £5,000 in cash in my rucksack and taking it to the bank every day. And I knew how much of that was going to the Buddhist Centre. Anyway, it was really good fun. And we watched the entire series of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So, probably going back a bit. Yeah. But we watched the entire series of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and we used to just I just remember that sort of sense of enjoyment and freshness, and we used to have these pujas around it in our community. We lived in a community together, and I remember for some bizarre reason why we decided to build the shrine inside the chimney, so that when you went to make your offering in the puja, you'd have to kind of go sort of inside the chimney to find the Buddha. Anyway, that was just a little memory. It's those wonderful times when you can experiment together, and just try something new together. I haven't repeated that particular chimney shrine, but maybe that's to come. I don't think it was our best idea. There's quite a lot of other ideas that we had, camping retreats and people round to our house. It's just, it's such a delightful way to live a life. So we have horizontal friendships when we're doing this together. Of course, there's always going to be a shadow side. So the shadow side to horizontal friendship is competitiveness. So I do know, having been around the Young People's Project for quite a long time, that there is always a little flavour of competitiveness in young people's relationship. So jolly good. There you go. You've got to... I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, actually. I think there's two types of competitiveness. There's the type of competitiveness which sort of pulls someone down. And then there's the type of competitiveness that brings us up. And hopefully, if we've got a bit of competitiveness in the Young People's Project or in the Groups and Pioneers, maybe, that it brings you up. Someone asks for ordination and you think, well, if you can ask for ordination, I can ask for ordination. It does make you question yourself. I know Pranya Gita, who I live with, is for a fundraiser for T. Ratnaloka Unlimited. She is reading all of the complete works from number 1 to whatever number it is. She's methodically reading it. And it has challenged me, because I think, gosh, I haven't done that. I'm not very methodical in my study, and maybe, I'm not saying I'm going to do it. Kalyana is doing it. She says she's doing it a lot slower than Pranagita, but it's really good. It's sort of challenged something about a view of myself, because she's doing much more. And also listening to her inspiration, she often talks about what she's reading, how that inspires her. It's really galvanizing. It's really exciting. It's really sort of made me want to read all the complete works of Sangharakshita. So, so there's competitiveness. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, as long as it lifts everybody up rather than drags anyone down. I think there's also the pain of just miscommunication. The pain of you're trying to work together and sometimes there's a little bump or a disharmony. You feel a bit misunderstood by your friend. There's a pain when people start having different ideals or making different life choices, and we start to wonder what's going to happen next in our friendship, and will they be around? Maybe they're going to move, or they won't be living in the community, or being in the same centre anymore. Maybe they're going to leave the movement altogether. And in fact, my friend Sarah did leave the movement, and I really respected that decision for her, but I also found it quite painful because I'd always imagined we'd get ordained together. Anyway, it's not too late, Sarah. Just say, if she ever listens to this. So yeah, it's not a sign when these things happen that something is wrong. This is the nature of friendship. It's not a static thing, it's a flow. And as conditions change, the friendship changes. And we shouldn't try and resist that, I think. What Sangharakshita says, he says, so long as there is genuine friendship, competitiveness within the spiritual community is generally harmless and even sometimes useful from a practical point of view. But it should be competitiveness of a playful kind. And the more spiritually developed you are, the less you will mind where you find yourself in the hierarchy. You will just step quietly and unobtrusively into the position that your qualities, or lack of them, warrant. Thank you, Panti. So, wherever we are in that spiritual development, a bit of competitiveness is fine, as long as it has that kind of playful, upwards, urging upwards sort of quality. And then there's vertical friendship. So the way that Sangharakshita talks about this in the Bodhisattva hierarchy, very interesting actually. He says you don't have to enforce hierarchy. You don't have to enforce a vertical relationship. He says that when you're with someone who is more spiritually developed than yourself, respect or reverence naturally emerges. And when you're in the presence of someone who's less developed than yourself, compassion naturally emerges. I don't know that I'd always put it in the language of compassion, but perhaps a kind of service, that you yourself, and we talked about this on the first evening, you yourself have been in a class where you've definitely been the more experienced one, and there's an urge to lend a hand. There's an urge, the sharing takes a particular quality. And that particular quality of sharing one's Dharma life is an invitation to join one. I think that's the sort of flavour. It's a reaching out flavour of sharing our Dharma lives to someone who's less experienced or newer than we are. And then when we're with someone who is more experienced, who perhaps has a higher ethical standard or a sort of more developed Dharma life than us, there's a sense of maybe a reaching up, maybe an aspiration to be like that. And I think that's a very beautiful thing, because what it's saying is that we have those emergent qualities within ourselves. And in saying yes to that person's qualities, we're saying yes to them in ourselves. We're saying, I respect and admire certain qualities that you've got, and they're emergent within me. So respecting them in you is also respecting those qualities that I wish to develop further in myself. And in seeing someone who's less experienced than ourselves, we can say, oh, I've got this experience. I've learned to work with myself in this way. And I think you could benefit from this in some way. I think you could benefit from what I've been given. One of the last things that Sangharakshita ever said to me is he said, it's a mistake to think that you can only tend to your own garden. His image was that we all tended to making what he called a garden in the wilderness, that we tend to a communal garden, that we help other people, and that out of gratitude for what we receive, we pass it on to someone else. So I think there's again a natural flow within that. The shadow side can be a kind of imposed hierarchy where, you say this person is a mitra and they've been a mitra for 5 years, and this person is an order member and they've been an order member for 5 years, and therefore you should treat them like this. I don't think we should ever insist on that in our community, because it sort of blocks this kind of natural reverence and this natural sharing of what we have. There's an idea of lineage, which I think has become, it's interesting, I've heard much more about lineage in the past few years than I have before. A response to the idea of lineage in a way that we haven't really explored before in the movement, at least in my experience. So I was looking up what lineage means, particularly what lineage meant to Bhante. And he said it's not a handing over or a transmission of teachings, but it's a continuity it's a continuity of experience. So we've got this phrase, that tradition is handing on of the flame, not worship of the ashes. But what does that actually mean, to hand on a flame? Well, you can't really hand on a flame itself. All you can do is hand on the stick on which the flame is burning. And I think what lineage means really is setting up the conditions for the next generations to benefit from what you yourself have received, and hope that they participate in them and have a similar experience to ourselves. So they're not going to have the same experience because they're not the same people. I think sometimes this is where I've come unstuck. I've sort of expected that if I provide the conditions for people, for the next generation, that they are going to have the same experience that I've had. But of course, we're different people, and they're going to respond to those conditions in their own way. But there's something that they just, when they get it, they use those conditions, they grab the torch and they experience the heat of the flame. They'll experience the heat of the flame in their own way. But they get it, they understand what's going on, they understand the benefit of those conditions and what can emerge on the basis of those conditions. So there's an experience that is shared, but it's not the same experience. And I have to say that I find this surprisingly ordinary. I think when I've heard about lineage, I've expected it to be something a little bit more esoteric. But I don't think it is that esoteric. I think it's about, out of gratitude and love, one sets up conditions that we have received, or even more than we have received, for other people to benefit from. And we do that out of gratitude, and we do that out of love. A love of what we've received, a love of the experiences that we've had under those conditions, and a love for other people so that they can receive those conditions and have that experience for themselves. So really the flow of Kalyana Mitrata is a flow of love and of valuing the same things that we can then hand on to each other. And I think when I think about lineage, I think it's important to remember that for the people who've gone before, they're really pleased if you take advantage of the conditions that they have set up. Because that's all really lineage is, it's setting up conditions. I was listening again to Bhante's talk, My Relation to the Order. And in it he's got this very lovely bit, which really, I remember when I heard it first, really struck me to my heart. He said, you are important to me. And he goes into that and he says, you're important to me because the order is my life's work. It's what I've spent most of my life doing. And I'm interested in anyone who is involved in my life's work, which is the order. And the order is just conditions for people to realize the truth, for the bodhicitta to arise or to understand more deeply reality itself. So anyone who takes part in the conditions that Sangharakshita set up, he was really delighted. And he says, you are important to me by the virtue of the fact that you are human beings who experience birth and death and who go for refuge to the three jewels. And I remember reading that or hearing it for the first time and thinking how important it is to me that is true. I never really understood the depth of why it's so important to me that should be true, but it is true because I share the same values, and I can only see the importance of that, of people sharing in the things that I value, as I've been more experienced in the order and I've started to ordain other people. It's the greatest delight to be able to share what's of most value to you. It's the greatest of delight to make your life's work a setting up of conditions and other people benefiting from those conditions and experiencing what you've experienced and valuing what you value. It's almost like it's being able to ordain other people has actually fulfilled my own ordination. It was waiting for me there in my own ordination, but my own ordination wasn't really fulfilled until I started ordaining other people, because I could share then what was most important to me. There's this wonderful story. I'm very interested in these stories about what happens to the Buddhist community after the Buddha dies, because obviously we're in a similar position with our own founder dying relatively recently. And in the early Buddhist tradition, they've got a collection of stories called the Avadanas, which are totally wacky. If you ever want to do a pantomime, just read the Divya Avadana and you'll find something in that is more wacky than any cow with two people in it. It's got dragons, it's got kind of ogres, all sorts of things are in the Avadanas. Anyway, there's a very, 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 very long story about Purna, which I won't tell you all about. But there's this wonderful moment. So Purna, he's this character who's a disciple of the Buddha who wants to go and spread the Dharma in the real Badlands, which unfortunately happen to be modern-day Mumbai. But it's in central West India. And he goes to these Badlands, and the Buddha says to him, look, what are you going to do if someone punches you? And he says, well, I'm just going to think I'm really glad they haven't hit me with a stick. He says, well, what are you going to do if they hit you with a stick? And he says, well, at least they won't have killed me with a knife. And he said, well, what are you going to do if they kill you with a knife? And he says, well, I'll just be glad that, I spent my life spreading the Dharma. It's for a good cause, sort of thing. Anyway, so that's there's that little story about Purna, but it gives a sense that he's gone to these real Badlands, and he sets up a Sangha there, and it's actually quite successful. He's managed to establish Buddhism really, really quite far away from where the Buddha was living. But there's one little story within the greater story where, even though he's an enlightened being at this point, so he gains enlightenment, he's a disciple of the Buddha, he's realized reality, he has unlimited compassion and energy, he has the mind of a Buddha himself, and at the same time he longs to see the form of the Buddha. And he builds the Buddha a sandalwood kuti, or a sandalwood kind of palace, actually more like a home for the Buddha, if you like, made out of sandalwood, very expensive sandalwood. And he climbs up onto the roof of this kind of sandalwood palace, and he strews incense onto the wind. He strews flowers onto the wind. May the white flowers of my longing be blown towards Shravasti, to lie at the feet of the Buddha. And he longs to see the face of the Buddha. And the story goes that those flowers and that incense kind of in the air form this beautiful palanquin which is blown towards Shravasti, which is in North India. It's a long way away. Blown towards Shravasti, and the Buddha gently steps onto the flowery palanquin and is blown back to the sandalwood palace. But even before the Buddha arrives, the sandalwood is lit up by a beautiful and mysterious light. I told you they were wacky. Anyway, and I feel that. I feel that no matter how far you've gone, no matter, even if you're an arahant themselves, no matter how far you've gone, there is a longing for recognition from your own teacher. There's a longing to touch the feet of the teacher. You know, Sariputta, when he died, he was one of the Buddha's main disciples, and he realizes he's going to die before the Buddha dies, and he goes to the Buddha and he says, "It's just to worship at these feet have I fulfilled the 10 perfections throughout countless ages. Let me embrace your feet before I die." And he lays at the Buddha's feet and he embraces his legs. You can imagine it's not just like a gentle touch on his feet. This is an elderly man. He's an arahant himself. And he embraces the Buddha's legs. And that's the last thing he wants to do before he dies. There's something in us that longs to be in relation to what is higher. And Vajratara brought that out so beautifully this morning. That doesn't end, that desire to honour what is higher, to be in relationship with what is higher, to be in relationship with one's teacher, to be in relationship with the lineage itself. So if you want to imagine Bhante Sangharakshita, all your teachers, all the people who've helped you throughout your own spiritual life, if you want to imagine them happy and pleased you are here, I'm telling you they're happy and pleased that you are here. You know, that's not a flight of imagination. Again, in that last conversation with Sangharakshita, came to me, he said, "Vajratara, why haven't you seen me for so long? You've left it so long to see me." And I never really imagined that he wanted to see me. But he did. And you yourself have had that feeling that, yes, you know, you valued something. You put a lot of effort into setting up the conditions for the next generation or the next people to benefit from them. When they come through the door and they're excited by the Dharma and they're really pleased to learn meditation and they ask you all the questions that they ask you, you love them. You know, they break your heart when they leave. But I can also tell you from the benefit experience that they do come back sometimes like 10 years down the line. But anyway. So this is the nature of spiritual community. It's not a cold thing. It's not just like someone writing a textbook. This is our hearts are on the line here. Anyway, right. I do want to finish up. I went a bit. I didn't write down that I was going to do all the stories about Sariputta and everybody. So there are conditions for friendship. That's what we're doing here. We're setting up conditions for friendship. That's all we can do. So one condition for friendship is funnily enough, aloneness. So there's just 3 that I'm going to talk about. Aloneness means that. It's funny, there's a dialogue between Ananda and the Buddha where Ananda says, and you've heard this before, I'm sure, spiritual friendship is half the spiritual life. And the Buddha turns around and he says, "Say not so, Ananda, say not so. Spiritual friendship is the whole of the spiritual life." But then he says something very interesting. He says, when a person has spiritual friends, they engage with and they follow the eightfold path arising out of solitude. Viveka, which also means independence of heart, or aloneness in the most positive sense. So they follow the eightfold path arising out of solitude. You've got this kind of intriguing mixture of friendship and solitude. And I think what he's saying is that in order to be a friend, we need to be able to be alone. Sangharakshita is very strong about this. He says loneliness is inherent in conditioned existence. And if we try and use friendship to distract us from the loneliness inherent in conditioned existence, that's going to put a pressure on our friendship that our friend cannot possibly fulfill. They cannot take away your existential loneliness, because existential loneliness is there because of the mind's delusion that we're separate. So until that mind, until we sort of go forth from the divided consciousness of self and other, we are going to experience existential aloneness. And we shouldn't avoid that through friendship. In fact, we might feel the frustration of it within friendship more acutely. So that feeling of trying to communicate oneself and it not being quite met is the human condition. And in a way, we have to get used to the fact that there is this existential aloneness. And in a way, I find it quite exciting, because it means that you never really know the other person. So you never, ever finish knowing them. You're never going to discover the ultimate truth about that person. You're never going to get to the bottom of that, who that person is. We're never going to get to the bottom of who we are. And there's some people with whom we can be alone. And that's a very precious thing. And we can be with our existential aloneness and be with their existential aloneness. So the ability to be with aloneness is an important condition for friendship. The other condition for friendship is opening up the citadel of the heart. So it's hard because sometimes we can experience what Sangharakshita calls the mutual responsiveness across a chasm. There's this chasm of feeling one's separateness from other people. We want to be met, we want to be known, but words can't fully express what we feel. So words have their own limitation, and we've got this inner experience, and we come out with a narrative that doesn't suit our purpose. So sometimes we can find ourselves talking to our friend and we kind of misrepresent ourselves. I sometimes find this, and I've given life stories, my life story a number of times over the years. And sometimes I just feel like, I just didn't really represent my own life story very well. That actually I've given quite a negative narrative, and that's not actually how I feel about things. And people might not receive what you say very well. So, there's you trying to express your inner life using words that have their own limitations. And someone then has ears that have limitations and they don't quite receive it well, or they don't listen fully, or they use it as a case for support for their old opinion of you. That can happen sometimes as well. So it's kind of fraught with complication, but we must keep trying. And we must keep listening, because that is the nature of human existence. The nature of human existence is this divided consciousness and mutual responsiveness across a chasm. And at the same time, we deeply, deeply know on some level that there's a possibility to be understood and to have a friend, that actually in the nature of reality is also that fundamentally we're not alone. So I think it's really important just to keep trying, to keep listening, to try and use words to get beyond words. And occasionally in friendship we can have these experiences where we can just be silent together, where words no longer have any meaning, and we reach a kind of different dimension of the kind of wordless understanding that one can achieve together. And some people might need a more formal environment to do that. They might need a more formal environment to open up. For example, like reporting in. Some people are quite shy to open up their inner life. Funnily enough, I think I'm quite shy to do that. And I work better in a more formal environment. But we also need a context where we can just be together and work together. Not just in an evening class, but in life itself. So we're hearing in our group today about, the first time that you go on retreat, and the first time you're invited on a retreat, and also you go in a group. And in a way, the friendship is made on the journey to those retreats. There's the retreats itself, but there's also going on the train together or getting in a car together. My friend Amogavanksa in Sheffield, he said he was having difficulty, particularly with men, trying to kind of get to the root of their sort of emotions in conversation. He said, it's like I'm just not getting there with them. So what I've decided to do, and I was like, what do you decided to do? And I go back and say, he said, I've decided to set up a men's allotment. And I'm not going to try and take them for a walk and talk, and I'm not going to try and take them for a coffee anymore. They're going to work on my allotment with me. And I thought that was such a genius idea. In a way, it doesn't matter what you do. It's that being able to be together outside of a formal environment that also makes it a Dharma life rather than a Dharma class. And you've all had those experiences. I can remember my first retreat. I was sort of, it was an order member called Manasa. Basically, he said, right, there's this retreat. I think you should go. I've already got you a special rate because you're, 18. And you can come, if you come to the Buddhist Center at this time, we'll give you a lift. I don't even remember even agreeing to go. It's just sort of ended up in this car with all these order members feeling slightly awkward. But by the time we got to Rivendell, which was where the retreat was, I'd completely relaxed. And I was then part of the Sangha, and I knew I was part of the Sangha. So you're being able to be alone, to open up the citadel of the heart, however that happens, and to not block the flow. I think we can block the flow of Kalyana Mitrata by trying to fix people. We universalize our current relationships with people. But things are always changing, so that if there's difficulty, it's very easy to get into a kind of fixed blame and lose confidence that we'll ever be in harmony again. But friendships are always moving, even if we're not in contact with that person. They're moving, you're moving. And hard as it is sometimes, we have to trust conditions and trust that things do change, that they're not stuck in a particular phase. So yeah, it takes time to work out what spiritual friendship is. And of course it takes time, because spiritual friendship is limitless in potential. So if we think we've understood spiritual friendship, we've got further to go. There's always a movement in friendship. It's not a static thing. Between people, what's vertical, what's horizontal, over time, all these elements of friendship are always changing. So I think it's good to think less in terms of having friends, but more in terms of setting up the conditions for friendship. And we do that by being able to be alone, by opening up the citadel of the heart, and by not blocking the flow of friendship and hardening it into fixed opinions about ourselves and others and our relationship. So I'm just going to end with a short poem actually that Bhante wrote about Lama Trungpa Rinpoche, Chogyam Trungpa, which I think says something about what we've all got to do. The time has come for us to lay aside the masks, painted hieratic masks. The time has come for us to hang up the gorgeous costumes in the green room cupboard, to leave the brilliantly lit stage, the applause, and to go home through deserted streets, to a quiet room, up 3 flights of stairs, and to someone perhaps with whom we can be ourselves.